high energy sounds. These are low energy, circular, swirling sounds. These are sweeping sounds with my hands, etc. But thinking about those activation methods and then kind of parsing them after the fact into different families or different groups. So here's an excerpt from the beginning. I need permission to play my own audio file. Let's see what that means. Wild. Okay, well, here, I'm gonna play it over here. So here's like the opening 4 minutes of the sound, of the piece. And I should say though that the opening 4 minutes are what I produced with using kind of traditional DAW-based approaches. I took all these sounds, I grouped them together, and then I just started layering them manually in a DAW and trying to make them not with this application. So I got about 4 minutes in, and then I didn't know what to do anymore, so I wrote an app. So here's what this opening sounds like. If I can get back to it, there we go. So I was writing this piece over the summer. I had all these recordings. I was very behind on where I needed it to be. And I had so many other recordings that I hadn't used yet. And, that's part of the process too, is making so much stuff and then kind of narrowing and refining the world that the piece is actually going to be made of all your materials. But I also wanted to explore some of these other things, but I found it being very time intensive, sequencing and layering these things manually. And I had already started diving into being able to sequence some of this stuff in Super Collider and in Max very quickly, using some generative or algorithmic procedures. So I took a pause at that moment where I had gotten and started to investigate ways that I could use the computer to work through all these other materials a little bit faster and generate some things I wasn't quite expecting. So the second half of the piece, I should say, it's 12 minutes in total. We won't listen to all of it, but this is about the first third or so of it. And the remaining 2/3 were made almost exclusively with the application. So there's really kind of a clear dividing point, because I think you can hear in that piece, or in that portion of the piece, all those things I was talking about, different shared characteristics serving different kind of functions, the sweeping sounds, the cutting off sounds with these scrapes and things, circular swirling sounds. But it all sounds kind of, the sounds themselves are long line. They have a kind of trajectory to them, and I'm not doing too much to them actually. Whereas the second half of the piece, or second 2/3 of the piece, have a different kind of character to them. And I thought I would just play like 2 excerpts that are a little bit shorter from kind of what I started to think of as the second movement of it. So this is, almost immediately after those opening 4 minutes. And this segment does have a little bit more space in it. There's a lot of kind of energy built up in that first part. So this second part does have some pauses, but as long as sound worked for all of that last one, no worries, sound is probably still working here, but you'll hear some sound and then silence and then sound again, kind of like all of music. So there's right around the beginning of this second movement part, and it continues in that fashion for quite a while, building up in intensity in different ways, layering lots of sounds together, but using this kind of approach of there's a very clear, beginning of a gesture, and then other sounds kind of come and emerge out of that with a variety of sort of textural energies. So here's another example of this. And this is something that's almost verbatim of the computer just spitting it out, and some tweaks here and there with filtering after the fact. But So just to give you an idea of how much difference there is between the parameters that you can set up in this application and have it be different every single time. I've got a small portion of the piece loaded up here that I thought I would just show you real quick before I dive back into some of how this program works. So if I load this particular preset up here, and I did change, yeah, I did, okay. I've got a bunch of the sounds from the piece. So there's, these mallet tremolo sounds. There's the drumming on the rim of the bass drum with sticks. There's additional mallet sounds scraping on the drum head, etc. Tremolos, of course.
Are we supposed to see the app right now?
Oh, can you not see it?
We still see the PowerPoint.
Oh, okay. Sharing is paused. Bring your window to the front. What does that mean?
Yeah, in my class earlier, I was just pulling up the new app and then turning on it, toggling sharing basically every time I switched apps, which is really annoying.
That is weird.
But although it says it's sharing the whole desktop, for me it was not. I don't know why.
How about, can you see the app now?
Nope.
Weird.
Still PowerPoint.
Okay. Well, let me stop that then. There we go. How about that?
Yep.
Great. So all I did was come up here, which I'll walk you through in a minute, and load up one of these demo sounds here from these old roots. And this is, a very dense excerpt where there's, lots of activity happening. But all of these kind of columns here have taken those sounds I've recorded and grouped them together based on like characteristics. So like mallet tremolo here. Mallet scrapes here. There's a couple of them there. There's like 6 of them. Mallet or bass drum tremolo with my fingertips here. There's some saxophone key clicky sounds over here. So all of these are grouped together, separated out from one another, and there will be kind of a global sort of rhythm of 6 seconds, 7 seconds, 2 seconds, 6 seconds, 5 seconds, 2 seconds, etc., where all of these voices are initiated and then sound happens afterwards using those same things. So I'll just play, I'll press my spacebar, it'll start generating sound, and then I'll stop, I'll do it again, and you can hear how it's essentially different every time. So there's, kind of one statement of it, and then if I play it back again, there's another statement of it. And there's a degree of similarity between those two things because they're the same sounds and whatnot, but nonetheless, it's still different every time. So,
I'm sorry, but do you have it set so that it always plays a file to its conclusion, even if you've cued a gesture before that sound is over?
No. So if I oh, sorry, I see what you're saying. Yes, if a new gesture comes in and the other previous file has not finished, then it will conclude, not until it's into the file, but until the end of the envelope that I've given here, this attack and release time. So it kind of just continues on. You can have up to 200 simultaneous things happening at the same time.
Okay.
That's pushing the envelope, though. It will kind of slow down a little bit as you get crazier with it. So there's just a little taste of it and how I was using this essentially. It did not look this fancy when I first was making this piece. It was very hacked together, and I was just generating sounds and kind of porting them back to the DAW. But essentially the same functionality is there. So let me switch back over here, and I'll tell you a little bit more about like what the thing is actually made of. Yeah, that's what I want. So in terms of how the program actually works, there's a couple different component parts to it. You've seen the interface so far, and it's textually driven, which is not something that everybody likes to work with. Text commands, that is. but that's how it works for right now. I can easily imagine a future time when I've got some, fancier graphical objects that are telling the computer these same messages that you're typing into those text boxes and whatnot. But the user interface does a couple of different things. First of all, in order to get sound into the program, there's this thing called the buffer maker, which I've found to be extremely handy. It allows me to drag and drop sounds in folders, and it automatically makes buffers for you. You don't even have to think about it. Have y'all dealt with sounds so far in Macs and importing sounds?
Sure.
Yeah, a little bit.
Yep.
If you have, then you know how annoying it is to create a buffer object, create a a play tilde or a groove tilde to play that object. Whereas the buffer maker thing, I spent way too much time making it so that I can just plop it into a patch and just drop files into it, folders into it, and it spits out the stuff I need it to. So it imports these sounds, and it does a very modest amount of analysis on them. It looks essentially at the sound file's name, and if it has anything resembling a pitch in the name, like C4 or G5 or something like that, it will add that to a dictionary kind of way of storing that data and saying the probable pitch in this file is whatever it determines it to be. So that's one part of it. The kind of core of the program, though, is all of these different voices that you saw, and there's up to 12 of them. You only see 6 at a time, but you can toggle back and forth. And the program's driven by a sequencer that tells those voices when to activate. And then within each of those voices, there's this thing called the message maker, and it is controlled by the kind of brains of the program called the patterner, which I'll talk about in the next slide. The patterner, you assign one patterner to every single kind of sonic aspect that you'd like to have controlled. The wait time between different events, the density, meaning how many sounds to play when a single event is triggered, things like what sound files you want to use, amplitude levels, panning locations. I realized when I was playing those sounds, I think Zoom compresses everything to mono, so you probably didn't hear any stereo stuff there, but there's a lot of stereo in the piece, and in the sounds themselves. So essentially, these are all the parameters that you would use in playing a sound back. You kind of have the parameter sitting there, able to generate data for it to play that. All those things are formatted together and sent over to, in one case, a score, which is actually broken right now, but you can go back and recreate things that you made randomly, but I got to fix that. But at the end of the day, all of those messages are sent to a simple sound file player that is a groove tilde object, receives a very complex message, it breaks all that down, it makes an envelope, it plays the buffer back that you want it to play, signs it to a stereo location, and spits out a sound that you hear. There's also a multi-track recorder. So my favorite thing about this is that each one of those voices can be independently recorded from the others. So, I've spent all this time segmenting the sounds out together. What if I want to make some changes after the fact? Well, I can record like a 24 channel sound file at the end, and then have a stereo stem of voice 1, a stereo stem of voice 2, and so on, and make some tweaks after the fact. The patterner is where the magic happens, as it were, and this is the thing that's kind of taken up the most of my time, because it is very involved. I'll show you in a few minutes what it looks like, but it does a lot of stuff. There's a kind of 3-stage process to it. It receives a message that you give it in the text box, and it goes through a whole bunch of things trying to figure out what's in the message. Once it figures out what is in the message, it starts to actually pattern values or create values, which can be unordered things like random. If you give it 5 sound files and say, give me random versions of these, it'll with an equal distribution, choose things randomly. You can do weighted randomness, so you can say, give me sound 1 10% of the time, etc. Sound 2 90% of the time. You can generate ranges of values. So let's say you wanted to generate, what's that thing? Attack times that lasted between 0 milliseconds and 1,000 milliseconds. It would find somewhere in between there to generate. Or earn, which is a max object, maybe you probably talked about before, that chooses randomly without repeating. And then there can be, of course, ordered values, things like if I gave it a sequence of 1 to 5, it would sequence 1, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and then stay at 5. Or I could loop over those things, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, etc. So the preprocessor does a whole lot of the legwork determining what's in a message. There's some really handy things for expanding number sets, or doing things that take a long time to type that help me not to do that. So I just clicked out. Where did my thing go? Did that go away? Screen sharing has stopped. Sorry, I just closed my window. I didn't even know how I did that. There we go, something like that. So basically, you give it a message, determines kind of the world of constraints that are there. The values that you give it can be scaled. You can add or subtract or multiply things together. You can reinterpret data if you want to think differently about things. Like sometimes I don't want to think about amplitude as 0 to 1. I want to think about it in terms of decibels. So if I want to convert something from decibels to a scale of 0 to 1, that might be a valuable way to think about numbers. And then timing is kind of the most critical thing, where you can give it 4 statements where you can say, for 10 seconds do this thing, for another 10 seconds do this thing over here. So it does a ton. Here's a couple of examples.
One quick question.
Sure.
When you talk about timing, the events that you played earlier were lovely, like arc-like gestures in spans of seconds. Is there a mechanism for like a metronome pulse for people who are interested in more pulsed work?
Yep, I've got a couple examples of that too. So you can
cool.
you can do things in rhythmic notation too if you want. It's not totally seconds driven. So you can give it a message. I'll skip ahead for just a quick second. You can give it a message like this: 1/8 note, 1/4 note, 1/4 note, 1/8 note, etc. And then you give it a little filter that says convert rhythms to milliseconds. So the underlying part of the program is always thinking about milliseconds. That's the kind of finest granular sense of time. But you can give it some hooks to get in there if you want.
Cool.
Yeah. Any other questions? I should say I'm kind of speeding through this. Anybody else want to jump in?
Keep speeding away.
Okay, great. So like some of the really basic commands that you could give it based on what I was just showing in this last slide here were, random. The basic syntax is that you always give it sort of how you want to pattern first, and then you give it what the things you want to pattern, or the variables that you need to constrain that patterning system. So random obviously would choose randomly equally for all of these. Earn would choose all of these numbers and then be able to start choosing a repetition of those numbers. Loop, as I mentioned, would sequence through these in, oddly enough, a loop. Sequence would go through this sequence and then stay at this last value here. There are ways to use some of these patterning methods that have additional controls that require the use of brackets to kind of say what elements are what. So for instance, something like weighted random, there are 2 sets of brackets that you need to have. You need to identify your items, so these would be sounds 1 through 3, and then you need to have a set of weights that determine what sounds should be chosen more often. So for instance, weighted randomness, 80% of the time, it would choose sound 1. 10% of the time it would choose sound 2. 10% of the time it would choose sound 3, etc. And then you can adjust those values if you wanted different weighted randomnesses. But the, I guess, syntax part of this that makes it a little tricky is that you have to put the items themselves in a series of brackets, the weights themselves in a series of brackets to kind of break that message off, and then the entire message in a series of brackets as well to kind of say, here's the thing, and then here's kind of the sub elements of that. All of this syntax that drives the program uses the Bach library. So if you are familiar with that from the course or have read about it, this is not my own creation. I'm totally indebted to Andrea and Daniela. They have made some insanely amazing software, and this would not be possible without them. So another example of that that's slightly easier would be something like range. If you wanted to generate 1 to 1,000, you could do that, and this would be a normal distribution. If you did a Gaussian distribution, which is what that sounds, which is what that means, anybody have an idea of what a Gaussian distribution would be different from a normal distribution, or rather a flat distribution?
Somebody want to weigh in here?
Everybody know? Is the bell curve. If you've never heard of it, bell curve is very symmetrical looking bandpass filter like shape, and essentially it would apply that to a range of 1 to 1,000. So something like 500, let's say, with a regular Gaussian distribution would be chosen way more often than something at the extremes. So that it'd be weighted so that the center part is more chosen more often. Something like X right here is exponential, which, sadly enough, we're all way too familiar with what exponential curves look like, because things towards the upper end of the range would be chosen far more often than things towards the lower end. Or you could do REXP, which would be a reverse exponential curve, so things towards the lower end, etc. With each one of these, you can give some additional controls. Like if you don't want a Gaussian distribution that's right in the middle, you could skew it to the side and say, like, I want 250 to be the center of the distribution, to be super nerdy, with a standard deviation of 50. So it can make your bandpass filter, if that's one way to think about it, much narrower than a regular distribution there. There are some convenience functions that you can use, which are, to make life easier. So my favorite one is sound set, which is what this S set means. So when you give the program a folder of sounds, it bundles everything inside of a folder into a sound set. And so one of the folders I've included today is something called demo sounds. If you wanted to access everything in the demo sounds folder, you could give it this command, say sound set demo sounds, and then it would, under the hood, create a list of every single sound that exists in that folder for you. So it's pretty darn handy. And with the next series of things, you can limit that world of possibilities even further if you want. Other simple things that are handy. Let's say I wanted to create, an arithmetic series from 100 to 170. All that means is that I would get 100, 110, 120, 130, etc., all the way up to 170. But again, typing is not always the most fun and creative way to work. So this allows you to just spit out some simple stuff really quickly. Other commands like this would be create a integer series of 4, 5, 6, 7, all the way up to 14. Or if I wanted to repeat values, I could do, I would get the number 4 7 times, I would get the number 5 6 times. So you can kind of create repetitions that way. This is really good for if you want to work with rhythms and you want to repeat a rhythm in for a number of times and then get another rhythm a number of times. Like I mentioned with creating this sound set thing, you can bundle that together inside of some parentheses, and then you can give another command that would say something like pick, 5 of them, and then it would just randomly choose 5 of those things to choose from. And you could keep it consistent, or you could keep that number of 5 changing. So. as I mentioned, you can scale and filter some of these things. So if I wanted to take all of these numbers, randomness, and increase them by double, I could just simply put a command in there that says ×2 or +100, and that would modify all the values here really quickly. Found that's really, useful creatively. If I'm making something rhythmically that's got, some onset points for when sounds to happen, what would it sound like to scale that out or to shrink that down? Before I made these, I'd have to go in there and type or calculate them out. And so having this is super handy. Again, because I like typing, but I also don't like typing. I don't want to type 1,000 milliseconds every time I want that. So, typing a number and then seconds to milliseconds would be another way of kind of making my life slightly easier. Another one of my favorite things about the Bach library and what I've kind of built on top of their great work is the support they have for pitches. So as I mentioned, when you load up sounds, if there's anything in the folder that has something resembling a pitch name, like C4, F#4, something like that, it will make a note of that. And then I can give it a command that says, here's the notes that I want, and I want everything to be tuned. So I can take, one of the things I'll show you in a minute is I take some bowed vibraphone sounds, and the pitches are all discreetly put in the sound file name. So then I can tune it all to a chord and get kind of a random series of chords. And you can get really fine tunings of sounds if you want. You can tune the pitch E5 up by a 6th tone. So lots to do there. Most of these things can be combined in various ways if you want to do some really complex things. So here's quite a complex example. I want to take 1, 2, and 3. I want to multiply those all by 5. After that, I want, -3, 0, and 3, all multiplied by 2, but then scaled them from decibels to amplitude values. So you can sequence all of these things together as long as you get kind of used to this bracket-like notation. Last thing I'll say before we jump into making some sound together, or demoing it at least, is some timing things you can do. I can say, random group of these 3 sounds for 5 seconds. And then after that, loop over these different sounds for 10 seconds. So you can kind of get different things to happen over a period of time. Questions, comments, horoscopes. So if you haven't downloaded it, you can go ahead and start downloading it here. There's a little tiny URL there if you want to test it out along with me. I should say, like, some caveats before we start diving into this. I completely rewrote the entire thing between like December and February. So this all came about because I wanted to integrate the Bach library. So this new syntax is still something in development. I find some situations where it crashes and I don't expect it to. Hopefully that doesn't happen today, but I use a Mac. If any of you use PCs, I think it should work, hopefully.
It's always an adventure.
Yeah.
So I'm waiting for mine to boot up right now, but if the rest of you who want to play along, if you've already downloaded it, you might want to double click and bring it up.
Well, let me keep that link up. Does anybody need the link?
I think I emailed it, a longer version of the link to people.
Okay,
earlier.
yeah, it's the same thing. So
one other thing I wanted to just chat to the group, and then Andres, you had something to say too, is that there's somebody in our waiting room who I don't recognize, and I'm not admitting to this meeting, who is Z557BL. So if any of you know that that's actually someone who belongs here, let me know. Otherwise, I will ignore that person. And this could be the first time that I've been Zoom bombed, if that is who it is. But I will not let them in because I don't know who they are. And I see one waiting and a message button, but I click on message and nothing happens. So I don't see a way to message that person.
Crazy.
Yeah,
I've not been Zoom bombed yet.
Interesting. So anyway, just thought I'd mention that. Andres, did you have something to add?
Yeah, I downloaded and installed the app, but like every time I try to open it, it just like don't open.
You have to control click on the app icon, and when a mini menu comes up, select open, and then a warning will come up, and you kind of hit the button that says open this anyway. I don't think it's spam or something like that.
No, it might be different on Windows or Mac, but Mac has a kind of control feature where if you're not a registered developer, sometimes you have to just say, I really actually want to do this.
Yeah.
I didn't know about the control clicking thing, though.
Yeah. Is it working, Andres?
No, and it's not giving me that message.
Hmm.
And I have allow apps downloaded from, I'm just going to put it anywhere for now. And then see if this will.
Yeah, Apple is afraid that people will stumble into opening malware, and so this has been around for the past 5 years, maybe.
Yeah.
And for independent developers, it's really annoying because you are sort of marked as being unclean in some weird way. But if you know it's from a trusted person, usually if you click the icon, control click it, a mini menu pops up, you select open, and then a warning will come up and say, do you really want to open this? And you click OK. If it's not working for you now, then we can try to talk about it after class, because just for the sake of time, probably Chris should move on. But
Yeah,
that's a bummer, because it's fun.
Yeah, I can just try to download it again, but yeah, it's not working.
This is good for me to know, because I'm not sure why it would do that. Here's one last area you might check out in your system preferences. If you go under security and privacy here, sometimes it will allow you to select something right here. Since I haven't tried to open it recently, it doesn't show it, but it might say open anyway up here, and you can click that. And
yeah, I'm familiar with that, and I did it already. I just select open any app from any server, but not working. So I'm just gonna download it again after the class. Let's move on.
Cool. Well, thank you. Sorry about that. So let me just, I'll just start to make some sound, and you can kind of follow along here if you'd like, or, you can load up your own sounds and make things too. So as I mentioned, there's 12 different voices in the program. Thinking about voices as a kind of grouping of sounds together. To get access to those, if you press the tilde key on your keyboard, it alternates back and forth between voices 7 through 12 and voices 1 through 6 here. Each one of these columns has all of the different parametric things you can control: wait times, density, which is the number of events when a voice is triggered, offset for if you want to, when a voice is triggered, have any of it be delayed, or if you want it to occur immediately at the beginning of a sound, of a request for a sound, buffers, amplitude for those sounds that are made, 4 things in a row that deal with attack time and release time, rate for transposition, essentially, of a sound, how quickly you want to move through that buffer, sound start position, so if you want to start 0% of the way into the sound to 75% of the way into the sound, so you can kind of scrub through or choose from somewhere within a longer sound file if you wish. Panning, which is obviously the stereo location of the sound, and then what outputs it would go to. Oftentimes I like to have each voice be a separate set of outputs so that I can record later on up here, which I'll show you in a second. But if you're just getting it loaded and going, the kind of steps you go through to get it working, I've already got mine working, so it's I've done all these steps, but you would click on the initialize settings up here, which allows you to change your audio outputs and all that business. I do recommend having overdrive on because when it starts making sound at a faster clip, sometimes the rhythms will be delayed unless overdrive is on. And you need to choose a kind of included project file to load up. So project files include, whenever you've opened the app, it saves all of the locations you've loaded files from. It saves all of your presets, all of your what I call meta presets, which are bundled presets, and it saves sound sets that you've created yourself. So you choose one of those things, and then you click initialize, and because you don't have the sound file location stored yet, you have to drag and drop it here, the bundle of demo sounds. And when you do that, it automatically stores where that demo sounds folder lives. So the next time you initialize it, you shouldn't have to do that. You shouldn't have to drag and drop it. Once you got that going, you can choose this thing up here, which will load up a meta preset, which is a group of presets for all the voices. So if I choose something like this, it will load up something for voices 1 through 7. There is one weird kind of bug where you get this message often changing between presets. It doesn't do anything. It's a bpatcher error that it's a bug that's been around for a while in Macs, and I can't. It's above my pay grade. But once you load one of those presets up, you can either press this button up here, which will start sequencing, or you can press the space bar, and then you should start to hear sound happening. So this is the second piece I wrote with it. It's called How Silence Comes, and it's a piece for guitar and electronics. If you ever want to step back and get kind of a neutral place to start, you can select this like series of underscores right here, and it kind of clears everything out. And then you can look something more discreetly at like a single voice to kind of investigate it further. So if you're following along and want to try this out, I recommend starting off with like a blank slate here, and then loading up something like this natural harmonics on A, which is a something for just one voice, and kind of didactic in a way. So what this does when I play it back, it's retuning a bunch of natural harmonics to the harmonic series of A, and it's looping through those in an ascending way, and it's looping through them at a very consistent rhythm right here of 500 milliseconds and 1,000 milliseconds. If I wanted to, I could keep the rhythm the same by doing this in sort of rhythmic notation. So I'd do you know, something like eighth note and quarter note, and then say rhythm to milliseconds, and then hopefully there's a tempo thing under the hood which I haven't made visible to everybody, so it's sped it up there, but it's the same kind of rhythm. So something kind of neat that I like to do a lot with this is have densities of 0. So you have a kind of consistent rhythm that's always happening, but sometimes it doesn't trigger, which is kind of confusing to think about, but it creates a kind of consistency in the sound, but occasionally there's a little bit of variation without having to do a whole lot of work. So what this says is that trigger sounds every 500 milliseconds, 1,000 milliseconds, and then a density of events when those things are triggered. 10% of the time there'll be no sound. Excuse me, 0. Yeah, 10% of the time there'll be 0 sound. 80% of the time you're only trigger 1 at a time. There'll be 2 notes triggered 30% of the time. So if I just let it play, you can hear a couple silences, and then a dyad right there. I don't know what the latency is like in terms of like when I identify things sonically and would say it, and then when you actually hear those things, but hopefully you can hear some of those things.
It's pretty synchronized. It's pretty good.
Cool, okay. So the buffer thing right here is using a sound set function where I've got everything loaded in a folder called natural harmonics, and so it just creates a huge list of all those natural harmonics, and it's retuning all of those. But if I only wanted to use a subset of them, you could, you know, give it a command like this where you'd say pick only, you know, 10, or rather 10, and then it would choose all those giant sounds and kind of bundle them down together. To give you an idea of what that sounds like or what that looks like, there's a handy debugging tool because I track down bugs with this thing pretty often. If I wanted to look at that, this is in voice 1, it's the buffer parameter. So I can come over to this debugging tool, which is under the icon panel.
We cannot see the other screen. We just see the menu.
That's handy to know, thank you. Let's see if I can get that working. I'm gonna need to do this twice. Okay, now, so here's what that debugging thing looks like. It's in this initialize settings window that pops up. You type in the name, the number of the voice you want and the parameter that you want. And then it will open up this other window, which I will share with you real quick. That looks like this. And basically it says, pick 10 of, it says, here's my sound sets, pick 10 of those things. It will expand out that list of sound sets now to something that's quite long. So there's like a bunch of them there that I can't even scroll and show you. Maybe I can, yeah. There's something like, I don't know, 30 different natural harmonics. And then from that, it chooses a subset of 10 of them to reduce it down to. I don't do any scaling on it. I don't do any filtering on it to change those things. But at the end of the day, it's only going to choose one of them to play back for you. Let's do this. Is it making sense so far? Is it any questions while I'm switching windows and stuff?
No, that's great.
Cool. So yeah, back at this main window, here's an example of like for amplitude, thinking about, you know, -6 dB plus 6 dB and changing that here. And one of the things I like to do is, you know, make changes to it over time. So if I came in here and just started to adjust this, maybe I'll make this rhythm. I'll do, you know, 2 of those, and then maybe I'll do something like a bit faster here. And this will change the rhythm as soon as you tab out of that. Once I've made a new change like that, see how this preset got a little grayed out here? That just shows you that the preset has been changed. So I can come up here, and with a couple of these commands, I can either update the preset if I want to keep it the same name, or I can make a copy of it. And then let's say I'll do this, call this thing new. And so now under this list here, there's my natural harmonics, the new version of it. There's one I was toying with before class. Make sure it worked. And then you can take that same voice preset over here and load it up and, you know, create a different version of it if you wanted to, you know, take some of these things, and if we modified the octaves of them, let's say, you could change all these numbers just to make them really apparent that they're different. Wanted to hear one voice and not the other, I can come over and mute one of them. Now I'm only hearing this guy. Or if I want to load up something while it's playing, I can mute this guy, come over here, and let's see what will sound good. I can load up. This will sound, oh. I knew it happened at some point. I just
crashed. Did it crash?
Crashed.
That's okay. That's cool.
That's all good.
But it sounded beautiful. It was really, really great stuff.
Thanks. Yeah. So this is the thing that, you know, I was working on it all through February, and then March came around and really upended things. But this is my one thing to dive a bit deeper into, which is the live performance tool aspect of it. After having integrated the Bach library so much, I think I'm pushing what they are normally doing to its limits a bit, so it throws these errors or crashes. So I gotta kind of dig into it and see where I can tighten up things a bit, which makes the studio possibilities of it, still fine. But
How much CPU load is it putting on when you have everything going bananas?
not a ton, honestly. At least on my machine. I was having a friend test it out over the weekend, and she was like, it's using like 70 to 80% all the time. And I think she had a slower computer or something. I did it on my wife's computer too, which is much older, and it was also moving a little slower. So I think it's system dependent. On mine, like I've gotten upwards to like 40%, so it's not hugely demanding.
Do you think that, have you been able to figure out like that there's a pattern to crashing that you could avoid in a performance, or is that not clear yet?
So I've recently learned how to read those crash reports that Apple generates, which I should have just shared that window. I just closed it, but it tells you what, this is pretty handy. It tells you what thread crashed, and in that thread, it tells you what objects or what that object was doing. And consistently, it's always an object within the patterner thing that's parsing all those messages. So I think there's some sort of hang up with it having to do a lot of that computation in real time and then spitting it out. I've also, took the approach of making it work and then going back and fixing it later. So it's working now, and I just got to go back and tighten it up to make it do its job a little better. I want to just show you one last thing now that's back up and running before we close off, or I can hang around and ask any questions if you guys want. Let me just load this guy up real fast. The thing that I love the most is being able to record and have multiple outputs happening at the same time. So let me load up my demo sounds over here. So just spit out a whole bunch of that. If I take this one as an example, this is something from the guitar piece. And notice that the guitar at the bottom here under outputs, it's got 1 and 2, 3 and 4, 5 and 6, etc. All the way up to 13 and 14. If I come up here to this thing, let me make sure I'm getting sound first of all. Yeah, can you all hear that? You can't hear that, can you? I gotta change this. So now you should be able to hear that. Yeah, okay, good. So I've got all the way up to 14 independent channels that I'm making sending sound to. So if I come over here to this little recorder, I just type in 14 and blah, 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 turn that back on. I can record. I'll let it go for a couple seconds. I'll stop. It keeps going, recording, so it captures anything that's still sounding for like 10 seconds or so, 5 seconds. And then a multi-channel file is generated. So this one was made, 1256. So if I plop this into a program.
We can.
Yeah, I'm switching the thing.
This is awesome because it's really frustrating if something is beautiful, but then you want to alter the balances a little bit. That's
exactly
delightful.
Yeah. Where did it go?
And which app are you pulling it into for looking at it?
I'm just going to do something real quick in Ocean Audio. It's just, or Amadeus. Either one of those two things are sound file editors that work pretty well.
Audacity will also open up these giant multi-channel files.
Yeah. Yeah, so here, if I share this now with you, everything takes so much longer in an online format. But you can see here, I've got now 14 different stereo stems, each one of those corresponding to one of those voices that I was just using. And when you load it up into something like Logic or Live, sometimes I'll have like, 14 here, 14 here, 14 here, and I'll kind of sculpt it and mix and match different iterations of it, because sometimes, one version produces this lovely motion and gesture. Other times it falls flat and sounds terrible. But the nice part about it is that I can, after the fact, come in here and say, I really like this part, I don't like this part, and I can cut that out. This program's not leaving space there, but in Logic or Live or something, you can kind of sculpt it a bit more easily. And, it's just a different way of working. It's not like a traditional method of composition where you're sitting and kind of imagining each event in sequence. Now I'm imagining like a kind of activity and period of time, which I can then afterwards go and sculpt and change. And I find that to be a really inspirational creative practice for me. It's like I've got stuff already, I don't need to worry about it, and now I can go through and impose upon it other constraints or find the music inside of it.
Have you ever used the output of this for instrumental pieces in that you actually ended up transcribing it for a group of instruments to play back?
No, but that's something I
here. Yeah.
Definitely I want to do.
Oh, okay.
It is. I mean, no, it's great. That's something I've spent so much time making it, and now I think for the next few years or so, I'm gonna not get as nitty gritty into things. Like there's a couple more features I want to add slowly, but I really want to just start making a lot more pieces with it. And so now I think the kind of framework is there. This idea of computer assisted orchestration and transcription is really cool. If anybody else has heard of that kind of stuff or is into it, there's some tools through Earcom that facilitate this on a little bit higher of a level. But I think that'd be really fun practice to get involved in too. Try out. I know we're kind of at time. If anybody had questions or thoughts or anything, I'm open to sticking around and chatting for a while.
I have another question, so I'm just going to chime in while others are considering. So you're sort of giving birth to this new thing, and it's amazing and it's very cool. You're still working out tweaks, which that's the story of anything we create. Yeah. What is your plan for making it known to the world or controlling or allowing access to it, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So I had in mind opening it up into the Bach world for a while and had the time to do that over the winter when it's very cold and snowy. And now that that's done, which is really what I wanted to do, and kind of formalized some of how you interact with it, and given people the ability to work with it without my having to say do this and do this, I can kind of create a documentation of it on my website or something. This kind of spring term or spring semester was really when I was thinking about letting more people know about it. So I gave a presentation on it at Splice a few weeks ago. I had this scheduled, and then I was going to also be demoing it at the Earcom forum in Montreal. So those are kind of some ways to kind of test it out in public. Unfortunately, thankfully this went on, but the Earcom thing was canceled.
Yeah.
But just to let a few people know about it, start to test it, and then in a few weeks or over the summer, start to open it up more and kind of make a more public announcement. Say, hey, try this out, and please send me stuff you make with it or bug reports too. Yeah. I am using some externals and stuff like that, mainly the Bach library. So I've released it in an application form like this so that hopefully it's consistent and usable for people. And that way it can also kind of continue to modify the bare bones of it. If you're curious what it looks like under the hood, I can open it up, and it's
Is there a help file, or there's something that we can use? I can't get the I can't get the stuff loaded. I dragged and dropped, but I don't have anything in my my window, the little window next to the garbage, whatever, where you have it there, next to the trash can on the first browser. And it's just not. And when I go to these separate voices, nothing is there, just a blank. You know.
Yep. So when you do that, did you drag and drop the demo sounds here?
Yeah, I dropped the whole file. I dropped demo sounds 1.
Great. And did you click initialize over here?
Yeah, I did that. Yeah.
What about when you clicked on the gear
icon? Now I clicked it again, and it's like I have the rounding circle. I'm wondering if I have enough power in this particular Mac. Or
okay, maybe that could be it. Under the gear,
the Mac shows it. The Mac shows all the stuff loaded. When I open up the Mac's window, it's showing me that everything is there.
When you do the when you open that gear icon, and did you select the demo included project file?
I have default right now. Just go to demo.
Select demo and then reinitialize, and it should pop up those presets for you.
Okay.
And you might have to drag and drop demo sounds again when you do that, but then it should.
But hit initialize again.
Yeah. So you do you do the demo.json, initialize again, and then drag that demo sounds again just to be safe. And then you should have the presets for sure.
And where do they show up? They should show up in that bar?
Yep. So you'd have some meta presets here that are like global for all the voices.
Oh, I see it. Right.
And then you should have these guys right here too for individual instances.
Mm-hmm. Okay, there they are, yeah.
If people wanted to build their own presets, they could just put a bunch of samples into a folder and then drag it in, essentially?
Yeah, exactly. So you put stuff into a folder, you drag and drop it here. If you want to modify presets over time, or sound sets rather. Hey, there we go. I heard something.
I got it going, yeah.
Cool.
Nice. Yeah, sweet. If you go under this sound sets button right here, it opens up a new window, which I now have to share with you. How do I get that? And under this sound sets listing here is all the different folders that I've had loaded up in that demo sounds area. So for instance, there's a folder in there somewhere called Glock Tremolo, and you can come in here and audition that. Or you can come under key click rhythm here and you can audition a saxophone key click sound. And if you want to build your own groups of sounds in the thing, you can come over and say, well, you can't see this, but it pops up in the little menu. I say new sound set, let's say, and then I can select that sound set here, and I can say, well, I want my mallet tremolo to be added to that thing. And now if I come over new sound set, that mallet tremolo sound has been added to it, and I can say this thing, add it to that as well. And now I've got 2 different sounds that are in that sound set, which is pretty handy. And the thing now that you can do is if you want it under new sound set, when you go back to the main program, you can say, S set in brackets and put new sound set there, and it will use only these 2 sounds.
Cool. Very cool.
Yeah.
Any other questions, concerns, thoughts, comments?
I was curious about whether you're interested in building in any interaction between voices, where one would dictate the outcome of another voice.
So that's a great question. That is one of the things that I'm really interested in. Let me show you one thing. So one very early version of that is something that's I think works and is being pretty consistent. If you come to a voice and you type sync in and you say voice 1, voice 1, then now that's in column 2, voice 1, in voice 2, this parameter will sync with whatever is in voice 1. And the one bug I've run into that is sometimes if the timing is off, it will be off by 1. So it might be delayed by 1. So it is synced, it's following the same material, but it's there's a small degree of latency there. I got to figure out why that is. But that's the first kind of step into having kind of interaction between them. Other things I'd like to do that I've kind of plotted out would be a trigger mode, where you'd say something like trigger, and then you'd trigger if density is 5 or something like that. So this thing would only trigger if voice, let's say, voice 1 had a density of 5. There's some computational problems with that because it needs to react really quickly, and sometimes I just got to tighten up the pattern essentially because it's the way I have it now. The latency would maybe not be super useful, but if you didn't care about strict timing, that could be very, very cool too. The one thing I have done, which is kind of fun, is this play mode here. This sequence thing is actually a button. So if I press that, it moves over to trigger mode instead of sequence mode, and I can do something like MIDI 60. And then because I got a MIDI keyboard over here, if I press 60 on my keyboard, I can just trigger it like that. So there's some performer ability to control it too, beyond like voices speaking to one another.
Nice.
Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Oh, thank you. This is pretty neat. It's pretty incredible.
Thanks.
Is there as you said, like you're like fine tuning some stuff before like putting it out public.
Yeah.
Luckily, I guess we have it now.
Yeah. You're the beta testers or something.
Is there a way you can share like a little bit of a list of the different commands you use?
Yeah. So
have,
in doing that like slideshow, I realized I didn't have a documentation of it. So I've got the old documentation for the old version of it on my website now, but the syntax has changed so much that it's not. So I would be happy to share with you an updated website when I get there. I can probably put something up fairly quickly, but maybe 3 days or so if you want to tinker around with it. For now, I could share the slideshow with you at least.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Cool.
I'll send it to Doug, and that'll at least give you some ideas, and you can kind of work backwards from there before I flesh out like an actual documentation page.
Yeah, that's great. I guess we'll just like keep looking at your website or whatever.
Yeah, or I'll send a message to Doug, and he can distribute to y'all later.
That's great.
Yeah.
One more question I'll have is like, have you? Well, I guess like this is pretty new. You've been working with it like for a while, but like it's now that you can actually constantly be using it. And have you have any collaboration kind of project with it? With
collaboration with other people?
Yeah.
No, it's really been just me, which is another reason why I'm like slightly anxious to like get other people using it, because if like someone's curiosity is piqued and wants to get involved with it, I'd be happy to like have other people to bounce ideas off of or distribute the workload. I will say it's just really satisfying though too to like I wrote Doug a message last night being like, I'll send you an updated link to distribute to everybody because there's this one bug that had been bugging me for forever and I fixed it. And it was just so satisfying. Yeah. So, I do like that too, but if anybody else is interested in it, that'd be great too. I've got lots of other things that like I could think about collaboration with visual media artists because this generates so much data. Like why not use that data also to trigger videos or control something else? So there's lots of possibilities, and I, in a way I see this as being like a place to make stuff for a little while and kind of sit with it and see what kind of comes out of it.
That's great. I guess we're 12 minutes over class time, so we should probably
thanks
end.
For sticking around though.
But this is really interesting and looks super fun to just sit around and play with. And if people have Contact Player or other sample sets, you might be able to drop stuff in there or massage it and drop in and really like create your own sound worlds. using the this piece of software. So it's super cool. And thanks so much, Chris, for taking the time to share it with us. This is great. And I missed your talk at Splice, so it's all new to me too. I apologize. I was going nuts to get my workshop together, and yeah, but it worked. And this in this class, we have been using the Bach package pretty repeatedly, but it is a vast achievement on their part. But I feel like the students are just kind of like scratching the surface of like wrapping their heads around what can you do with these tools. So it's also cool to see someone integrating it with in a larger context and getting something amazing to happen with it. So that's also great. If people in the class have particular questions for you, is there a best place they could reach out to you if they wanted to ask you anything, or is there? Yep. What would you recommend?
Yeah, I'll just put my email in the chat, and y'all will have it and can get in touch. Something like that. So feel free to email me there, and we can go over things in more detail, or I can answer any questions or what have you. It's there's so much stuff too I didn't get to cover. Like it's my baby. Like there's even I'd love to geek out with anybody that's interested in it with you. But yeah, feel free to reach out. Happy to chat.
Okay, awesome. Thanks so much, and this has been great.
Thank you.
And everybody else, including our guests, thank you for taking the time to be here. And for those of you in the class, I'll post my slides from earlier, and I'll repost the patches that I was showing and talking about. And if you have any questions about any particular one, I know a couple of you have weighed in with some questions, and if it's easiest, I can answer that with the video as well. Otherwise, I'll see you all next Wednesday, I guess. All right, so thanks again, everybody, especially Chris, and look forward to seeing you all again. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody. Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Doug.
Thank you. Bye.